Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're looking at how our brains use context. And it's interesting because if you hear the word fire, if you're sitting around a campfire, that word has a very different meaning than if you're in, say, a crowded movie theater.
Absolutely. Different situations call for different reactions.
Yeah, and this paper really dives into how two parts of the brain, the orbitofrontal cortex, the OFC, and the dorsal hippocampus,
A DH.
the DH, work together to make sense of the world.
Right. Those are key players.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is that the OFC is like the conductor, helping us understand the context. And the DH is like this memory weaver, connecting new information with what we already know. It's a beautiful interplay.
Yeah, and they did some really interesting experiments with rats to study this.
Oh, yeah. The rat models are really insightful.
Yeah, and the findings, I think, will blow your mind.
I think so, too.
Especially when it comes to things like leadership and decision-making.
Because context is everything.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about how they studied this in rats.
Well, they started by looking at something called hierarchical associations. And the basic idea is that context acts like a mental filter. It helps your brain pull up the right information based on the situation.
So, if I see my boss in the hallway, my brain is going to pull up a different set of associations than if I see my best friend, right? And this ability to use context is crucial for a lot of things, like knowing when to speak up in a meeting versus when to just listen.
It's all about adapting to the situation.
Yeah, and once you kind of understand that certain social cues mean different things in different cultures, you start to pay more attention to those subtle signals everywhere you go.
You become more attuned.
Yeah, it's context matters.
Exactly.
Okay, so this is really interesting.
Yeah.
But how did they actually study this in rats?
Well, they designed these two really clever experiments. They trained rats on two different tasks. One was context dependent, where a cue, like a sound, only predicted a reward if a specific visual background was present.
So, the rat only gets a treat if they hear a beep when a red light is on.
Exactly. And the other task was simple. The cue always meant the same thing, no matter the context.
So they always got a treat when they heard the beep, no matter what color the light was.
Yeah, that's the simple one.
Okay, and then what did they do?
Well, then they used this technique called chemogenetics
Chemogenetics.
to temporarily silence either the OFC or the DH in the rats.
It's like temporarily dimming the activity in those brain regions?
Yeah, like turning down the volume.
Wow, that's incredible.
It allows you to see what happens when those regions aren't working at full power.
So what did they find when they dimmed the OFC, the context conductor?
Oh, it was pretty wild. Silencing the OFC really messed up the rat's performance in the context-dependent task.
So they couldn't figure out which cues mattered in which context?
Exactly. They started responding to cues even when they shouldn't have because they weren't paying attention to the context.
Oh, so it's like they forgot the rules of the game.
Yeah, it's like they were missing that crucial piece of information.
That makes me think about that time. I totally misread a text from my boss.
Uh-oh.
Because I didn't have the full context.
Oh, context is key.
It was so awkward. Maybe my OFC was taking a nap that day.
Maybe it was on a coffee break.
Okay, so that's the OFC, the context conductor. What about the DH, the memory weaver? What happened when they dimmed that area?
Well, this is where things get a little surprising.
Uh.
Inactivating the DH didn't really affect the rats' performance in either task once they had already learned it.
So it wasn't like they suddenly forgot everything.
No, they still remembered what they had learned.
Hmm.
It suggests that maybe the DH isn't constantly checking to see if a cue is relevant in a particular context.
So it's not like the DH is the librarian frantically searching for the right book every time we encounter a new cue.
Right. It seems to be doing something else that's important.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So was that something else?
Well, to figure that out, they introduced a new cue. This one always led to a reward, but it only showed up with that specific visual background.
So they were adding a new piece of information to see how the rats would integrate it with their existing knowledge.
Precisely. They wanted to see if the rats would assume that this new cue was also context dependent.
Even though they'd never seen it before in the other context.
Exactly. It's like testing their assumptions about the world. Remember that new cue that always led to a reward, but only with that specific background?
Yeah, the one they were using to see if the rats would make assumptions based on their past learning.
Exactly. And the rats that learned that context mattered in the first task, They totally assumed this new cue was also context dependent.
Even though they'd never seen it in the other context.
Right. They had no direct experience with it in that other context, but they still made a prediction based on what they had learned.
Wow. So they were like, okay, in this world, things depend on the situation, so this probably does too.
Yeah, it's like they're building a model of how the world works and then using it to make predictions about new information.
It's amazing how our brains can do that.
Right. It's not just about memorizing facts, it's about understanding the underlying patterns.
So what about the other rats, the ones who had learned the simple discrimination task?
The ones where context didn't matter.
Yeah, did they make the same assumption about the new cue?
Those rats treated the new cue as always rewarding no matter what the context.
So their past experience shaped how they interpreted this new information.
Exactly. It's like they had a different mental model, a different set of expectations.
This is so cool. It's like we're all carrying around these invisible maps in our heads.
And those maps are constantly being updated as we learn new things.
And those maps guide our decisions, our interpretations, everything.
It's incredible, isn't it?
Totally. So it seems like both the OFC, the context conductor, and the memory weaver are involved in building those mental models.
Yeah, they both play crucial roles.
But what happens when we get information that contradicts our existing maps? Can our brains handle that?
That's a great question, and that's what the researchers wanted to explore next.
Okay.
So they decided to try to trick the rats by suddenly rewarding that new cue, the one that was context-dependent. Both contexts, regardless of the background.
So they were messing with the rules.
Exactly. And you can probably guess what happened.
The rats were confused.
Yeah, their performance on the original task declined because they were getting conflicting information.
But what about the OFC and DH? Did silencing those regions protect their learning?
That's what they wanted to find out. But the answer was a little bit surprising. Even when those regions were silenced, the conflicting information still changed their understanding.
So even with the context conductor and the memory weaver taking a break, their brains were still susceptible to new information.
It suggests that those brain regions are essential for building knowledge, but they might not be the key players in protecting that knowledge from being overwritten.
Well, that's kind of disappointing. I was hoping for a brain shield.
I know, right? But it also makes sense our brains need to be able to adapt to change, even if it means revising what we thought we knew.
That's true. So if the OFC and DH aren't the brain shields, what helps us handle these tricky situations?
And what does all this mean for us in our everyday lives?
Especially for those of us who are trying to be good leaders and decision makers.
Yeah, how can we use this knowledge to navigate a world that's constantly changing? It really makes you think about how we process information and make decisions.
Right, so we've been talking about these mental models that we build based on our experiences and how the OFC and the DH help us with that.
Right, the context conductor and the memory weaver.
But the big question is, what do we do when those mental models are wrong or they don't fit the situation?
Think about leaders and decision makers. They need to be able to handle that kind of uncertainty.
So it's not enough to just build those mental models.
No, you got to be willing to update them. And that can be hard sometimes.
It can be really hard, especially when it challenges our assumptions.
Right, but it's essential if you want to make good decisions.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we stay flexible?
Well, one key is active listening.
Active listening.
Yeah, really hearing what other people are saying, even if you don't agree with them, getting outside your own bubble.
And being willing to question your own biases. It's like admitting that you might not have the whole picture.
Exactly, and that's a sign of strength, not weakness.
I like that. So it's not about throwing out your whole mental model.
Right.
It's more like you're adding new roads to the map or maybe redrawing some boundaries.
Yeah, as you get more information and experience.
So how does this apply to, like, leading a team?
Well, if you go into a meeting thinking you already know everything, you're probably going to miss out on some valuable insights from your team.
But if you go in with curiosity and you're open to hearing different perspectives,
then you create an environment where good decisions can happen.
it's about recognizing that your mental model is a work in progress. And it's also about recognizing the context. A decision that's brilliant in one situation.
Right. Could be a total disaster in another.
And that's where that context conductor, the OFC, comes in.
It helps us understand the nuances of each situation, picking up on those subtle signals that tell you, hey, this is different. You need to adjust your approach.
And that's a skill you can develop.
Absolutely.
The more you pay attention to the context, the better you get at adapting.
And the better decisions you'll make. It's fascinating how much our brains are doing behind the scenes. Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
And it makes me realize that being a good leader isn't about having all the answers.
No, it's about being willing to learn and adapt and embracing the fact that we're all lifelong learners.
So here's a little challenge for everyone listening.
Okay, I like a challenge.
Think about a decision you made recently. or a situation where you had a strong reaction. Now ask yourself, what mental models were you using? And how did the context influence you?
And is there anything you might do differently next time?
Something to think about. All right, that's all for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep those brains buzzing.